The official story goes like this: cities grow because people arrive. Population increases, demand rises, infrastructure follows. That's the accepted sequence, the one taught in urban planning courses, repeated in history textbooks, assumed in every municipal development report written in the last 2 centuries. Chicago in 1850 had roughly 30,000 residents. By 1900, it had 1.7 million. The infrastructure, according to the standard account, scaled alongside that population. Roads were built as neighborhoods formed. Water systems expanded as demand required. The city grew organically, messily, the way all cities grow, one block at a time, one crisis at a time. That's the accepted story. Here's what the construction records actually show. In 1855, engineers in Chicago didn't build a small water system for a city of 30,000. They built one capable of serving several 100,000. The tunnel diameter, the storage capacity, the intake infrastructure, all of it was scaled to a population that wouldn't arrive for another 40 years. Engineers at the time were asked why. Their answers, preserved in city council minutes, were vague. Future planning, one report noted. Anticipated growth, said another. 40 years is a long time to anticipate. Before going further, something should be said clearly. This documentary examines historical infrastructure records, geological surveys, and urban development timelines. Everything presented here is drawn from documented sources: municipal records, engineering reports, architectural surveys. The goal is to follow the evidence wherever it leads, not to arrive at a predetermined destination. What follows is not a conclusion. It's an examination. The city of St. Louis presents a similar profile. In the 1840s, when its population hovered around 16,000, the city commissioned a SAW network whose capacity calculations, still readable in the original engineering documents at the Missouri History Museum, assumed simultaneous use by populations far exceeding anything the city had yet seen. The pipes were wide. The junctions were reinforced. The whole system was built, as one 19th-century engineer's notation reads, in anticipation of a scale not yet realized. Not yet realized. That phrase appears with unusual frequency in infrastructure documents from this period. Engineers writing about water systems, sewage tunnels, road foundations, rail corridors, again and again, the phrase recurs in various forms. Built for tomorrow. Designed for a scale not yet arrived. Intended for future populations. In isolation, each instance sounds like prudent planning. Taken together, the frequency starts to feel like something else. Detroit's underground infrastructure tells a version of this same story. When systematic excavation began under the city's downtown core in the late 19th century, workers encountered foundation structures that predated the mapped construction timeline. Not by a year or two. By what geological and material analysis suggested were decades. Some foundation stones showed weathering inconsistent with their supposed construction dates. Limestone erosion patterns, mortar composition analysis, oxidation on embedded ironwork, all pointing toward an earlier origin than the official record acknowledged. The city's response was to reclassify these anomalies as measurement irregularities and continue construction above them. The records of that reclassification are still accessible, if you know where to look. Here is where the pattern becomes harder to dismiss as coincidence. In 3 separate American cities, Chicago, St. Louis, Detroit, within roughly the same 20-year period, infrastructure was constructed at a scale dramatically exceeding the population it was meant to serve. In each case, the construction preceded the demand. In each case, the official explanation centers on forward-thinking urban planning. And in each case, the engineering choices, the specific dimensions, load tolerances, material specifications, were not conservative estimates. They were precise calculations for populations of a very specific, very large size. Precise calculations require data. Data requires something to measure. The underground dimension of this pattern deserves particular attention. Because while above-ground infrastructure can be explained by speculative development, below-ground construction tells a different story. Tunnels are expensive. They require significant capital investment, engineering expertise, and a compelling reason to build. You don't tunnel under a city of 30,000 people on a guess. And yet, beneath Chicago's Loop, beneath the older sections of St. Louis, beneath portions of Detroit's original settlement grid, there exist tunnel systems whose construction logic, when examined against the population data of their supposed build periods, doesn't quite resolve. Some of these tunnels were later repurposed for freight, for utilities, for cable routing. Their origins were absorbed into later infrastructure narratives. The question of why they were originally built, at that scale, at that time, was answered administratively rather than architecturally. Administrative answers and architectural answers are not always the same thing. There's a word that appears in fringe internet communities, in late-night forum threads, in the comment sections of certain YouTube documentaries, Tartaria. It's used loosely, inconsistently, attached to photographs of ornate 19th-century buildings, to underground tunnels, to infrastructure anomalies exactly like the ones described above. For now, set that word aside. What matters at this stage is the pattern itself, stripped of interpretation, stripped of the mythology that has grown around it. What matters is that across multiple American cities, in the same historical window, infrastructure was built for populations that didn't yet exist. The question that follows from that observation is not about conspiracy. It's about sequence. If cities grow because people arrive, and infrastructure follows population, then what explains infrastructure that arrived first? The answer might be straightforward. It might be planning. It might be investment speculation. It might be engineering conservatism written unusually large. Or it might point toward a timeline of urban development that doesn't quite match the one we were given. England didn't build the Erie Canal. That's an obvious statement. The Erie Canal was an American project, completed in 1825, connecting the Hudson River to Lake Erie across 363 miles of New York terrain. It was, by every account, a monumental engineering achievement, the kind of infrastructure that reshaped a continent's economic geography almost overnight. What's less discussed is the timing. When construction began in 1817, the population of the entire Great Lakes region, the area the canal was ostensibly designed to serve, was sparse enough that most contemporary European observers considered the project financially indefensible. A canal of that scale, serving that few people, made no commercial sense by the logic of the era. Canal projects were built to move existing goods from existing populations to existing markets. The Erie Canal was built before any of those things existed at the scale the infrastructure assumed. Within 2 decades, the population arrived. The trade followed. The canal became profitable. But the sequence remains, infrastructure first, population second. And the gap between the two was not a matter of months. It was a matter of generations. The same sequence appears in Britain, across a different landscape but with unsettling consistency. The British rail network expanded with extraordinary speed between 1830 and 1850. This is well documented, celebrated in engineering history, explained as the product of industrialist ambition and Victorian capital speculation. The standard account frames it as a chaotic boom, competing companies laying tracks across the countryside in a frenzy of overlapping ambition. Look closer at the engineering specifications, however, and something quieter emerges. The gauge widths. The tunnel dimensions. The station platform lengths built during this period, particularly across the northern lines connecting Manchester, Leeds, and Liverpool, were not built to accommodate the trains of 1840. They were built to accommodate trains considerably larger, and passenger volumes considerably higher, than anything operating at the time. Brunel's broad gauge, famously oversized for its era, was not an anomaly. It was one of the more visible examples of a specification pattern that appears throughout the network. Engineers of the period were asked about this repeatedly. Their answers centered on future-proofing, on anticipated demand, on building once rather than twice. Which is sensible, unless the demand being anticipated was far more specific than a general optimism about rail travel would explain. Storage infrastructure tells an even quieter version of this story. Grain storage facilities built across the American Midwest during the mid-19th century, the great elevator complexes of Buffalo, Toledo, and Milwaukee, were constructed at capacities that exceeded regional agricultural output by margins that contemporary analysts noted at the time. The Buffalo Commercial Advertiser, in an 1847 editorial, questioned the economic rationale of grain elevator construction that seemed to assume harvests the region had never produced. The harvests eventually came. The storage was eventually filled. But again, the infrastructure preceded the reality. Not by a small margin built on reasonable optimism, but by a specific margin that implied a specific expectation. Expectations require a basis. The electrical grid presents perhaps the most striking version of this pattern, precisely because it emerges in a different century, removing the possibility of a single shared historical cause. When electrical infrastructure was first laid across American cities in the 1880s and 1890s, the initial consumer base was small. Electricity was expensive, largely industrial, adopted slowly by residential users. By conventional economic logic, grid infrastructure should have expanded incrementally, small capacity, upgraded as demand grew. In several cities, it didn't work that way. The substation infrastructure built in Chicago between 1890 and 1910, documented in Commonwealth Edison's original engineering records, was designed for load capacities that the city's actual electrical demand wouldn't reach for another 30 years. Transformer specifications, cable gauges, switching infrastructure, all of it scaled to a future that hadn't arrived. Engineers who worked on these projects left notes, still readable in archived records, describing their specifications as designed for eventual full urban penetration. Full urban penetration. In 1895, when less than 5% of Chicago households had electrical service. What accumulates across these examples is not a single anomaly but a structural pattern. And structural patterns demand structural explanations. The conventional explanation, that engineers in the 19th century were simply optimistic, simply future-minded, simply building for anticipated growth, begins to strain under the weight of specificity. Optimism is general. These specifications were precise. Optimism builds a little larger than needed. These projects built at multiples of existing demand, calibrated to population figures that would take decades to materialize. There's a difference between a farmer who plants extra seeds in case of a bad harvest and an engineer who designs water mains for a city of 400,000 when 40,000 people are alive to use them. One is prudence. The other implies knowledge. The administrative dimension of this pattern deserves attention, because it's perhaps the least dramatic and most significant thread. Across American and British urban development in the 19th century, there is a recurring administrative similarity that has received almost no scholarly attention. Municipal engineering departments, established in cities as different as Philadelphia, Glasgow, Cincinnati, and Birmingham, operated according to strikingly similar structural logics. Similar departmental hierarchies. Similar documentation formats. Similar specification languages in their engineering reports. This could reflect the natural diffusion of professional standards across an interconnected Atlantic engineering culture. That's the straightforward explanation, and it's probably partially correct. But the similarity extends into areas that professional diffusion doesn't easily explain. The specific ratios used in infrastructure scaling. The particular assumptions embedded in capacity calculations. The recurring presence, in city after city, of what engineers of the period called reserve capacity, infrastructure built beyond present need, held in reserve for populations not yet counted. Whether this reflects inheritance from a shared template or convergence around shared assumptions, the administrative fingerprint is consistent enough to notice. And then there are the tunnels. Beneath London's older districts, beneath the pre-fire foundations that survived into the 19th century, excavation projects across 200 years have repeatedly encountered structural work that resists clean dating. The Smithfield area. Portions of the old city wall corridor. Sections beneath what is now the financial district. Tunnel systems, chamber structures, foundation work that appears in excavation records as anomalous, older than expected, larger than required, built with material choices that don't align with the supposed construction period. The official response to these findings has been consistent: reclassification, reintegration into the existing timeline, and a return to the approved narrative of gradual urban development. Each individual instance can be explained. The consistency of the explanation is what becomes difficult to accept at face value. There is a label for what this pattern, taken whole, is said to represent. A name that carries enormous cultural baggage, that has been attached to flat earth forums and AI-generated photographs of impossible palaces, that most serious researchers dismiss without examination because of the company it keeps. That label, and what it actually refers to, stripped of the mythology, is where this examination has been heading all along. The name is Tartaria. And the real question isn't whether the name is credible. It's whether the pattern underneath the name is. The word Tartaria appears in European maps as early as the 13th century. It wasn't a fringe term. It wasn't invented by internet forums or alternative history communities. For several centuries, Tartaria, sometimes spelled Tartary, appeared in the atlases of mainstream European cartography as a designation for a vast territorial region spanning from Eastern Europe across Central Asia into what is now Siberia and parts of China. Joan Blau's 1662 atlas, one of the most authoritative geographic documents of its era, includes Magni Tartarii, Great Tartary, as a named political and geographic entity covering an area larger than any single European nation. This was not mythology. This was cartography. The region designated as Tartaria was populated, traded with, written about in diplomatic correspondence, and engaged with militarily by European powers across centuries. Russian imperial expansion into Siberia was, in part, a campaign against Tartarian-administered territories. The records of that expansion, military dispatches, land surveys, population censuses conducted by Russian imperial administrators, reference Tartarian governance structures, Tartarian cities, Tartarian trade networks. And then, with remarkable speed, the term disappears from official usage. By the early 19th century, Tartaria as a named entity had been effectively dissolved from European cartographic and diplomatic language. The territories it described were redistributed into other administrative designations. The populations it identified were reclassified under different ethnic and national labels. The cities it had named were renamed. The historical explanation is straightforward. The region was absorbed into expanding empires, primarily Russian, and the administrative vocabulary shifted accordingly. Empires rename what they conquer. That's not unusual. What's unusual is the speed of the erasure, and what was lost with the name. The modern reinterpretation of Tartaria, the version that circulates in online communities, that gets attached to photographs of ornate 19th century buildings, that animates the infrastructure anomalies discussed in this documentary, is not a single coherent theory. It's a collection of loosely related observations gathered under a convenient label. At its most extreme, it becomes indistinguishable from science fiction. Claims of mud floods burying entire civilizations, of reset events erasing human memory, of global coordinated conspiracies to suppress a lost empire's legacy. These versions are dramatic, internally inconsistent, and unsupported by the kind of documentary evidence that serious historical examination requires. But underneath the dramatic layer, there is a quieter version. A version that asks more careful questions. And that quieter version is what the infrastructure pattern this documentary has been tracing actually points toward. There are, broadly, three interpretive frameworks through which the accumulated evidence can be understood. None of them is complete. None of them resolves every anomaly. But each of them takes the documented record seriously, and each deserves to be examined on its own terms. The first framework is the inheritance model. This interpretation holds that 19th century infrastructure development in America and Britain was not built from scratch but partially inherited, built upon, incorporated into, or deliberately designed around pre-existing structural foundations whose origins predate the official construction record. Under this reading, the oversized tunnels, the anomalous foundations, the infrastructure scaled for populations not yet present, all of it reflects not optimistic planning but practical adaptation. Engineers working above structures they didn't build, designing systems to interface with capacities already in the ground. The inheritance model doesn't require a global conspiracy. It requires only that some portion of urban infrastructure has older roots than the official timeline acknowledges, and that subsequent administrations, for reasons of political continuity, property law, or simple bureaucratic convenience, incorporated those structures into their own records without flagging their true origins. It's the least dramatic interpretation. It may also be the most structurally sound. The second framework is the convergence model. This interpretation accepts the official construction dates but argues that the pattern of oversized, premature infrastructure reflects not individual city planning but coordinated development according to a shared template, a master urban framework that was applied across multiple cities simultaneously, by interconnected networks of engineers, financiers, and administrators who were operating from population projections unavailable to the public record. Under this reading, the Erie Canal wasn't built on optimism. It was built on data. Demographic projections, migration models, agricultural yield forecasts, information that existed within certain institutional networks but wasn't reflected in public documentation. The infrastructure preceded the population because those building it already knew the population was coming. The convergence model is harder to dismiss than it sounds. 19th century urban development was not a democratic, transparent process. It was driven by small networks of capital and technical expertise, operating across national boundaries, sharing information through private correspondence and professional associations that left incomplete public records. That these networks might have shared planning frameworks more sophisticated than their public statements suggested is not a radical proposition. It's a fairly ordinary observation about how institutional power operates. The third framework is the rupture model. This is the interpretation that most closely aligns with the dramatic Tartaria narrative, though in its serious form it's considerably more restrained. The rupture model holds that the historical record contains a genuine discontinuity, a period in the early 19th century during which something significant happened that disrupted an existing pattern of human settlement and development, and that the infrastructure anomalies visible across American and European cities reflect the aftermath of that disruption rather than its anticipation. The year 1816 is significant here. Known historically as the year without a summer, 1816 followed the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia, the largest volcanic eruption in recorded history. The atmospheric effects were global and severe. Crop failures across North America and Europe. Mass migration. Famine. Social disruption at a scale that reshaped settlement patterns across an entire decade. What the rupture model asks is whether 1816 and the years surrounding it represent not just a climatic event but a civilizational inflection point, a moment at which an existing pattern of urban development was interrupted, partially erased, and then reconstructed by the populations that survived and the institutions that reconsolidated in the aftermath. Under this reading, the infrastructure that predates its supposed populations isn't premature planning. It's remnant infrastructure, structures built for a civilization that was interrupted, later discovered, reproposed, and absorbed into a new developmental narrative without full acknowledgement of what had come before. None of these three frameworks is a conclusion. That word, conclusion, implies an endpoint, a resolved question, a case that has been made and closed. What the documentary record actually offers is something more uncomfortable and more interesting, a pattern that resists the official explanation without definitively supporting any single alternative. The evidence invites examination. It doesn't demand a verdict. What it does demand is intellectual honesty about what the standard account leaves unexplained. The tunnel systems beneath Chicago whose construction logic doesn't resolve against population data. The British rail specifications built for trains not yet designed. The grain elevators of Buffalo sized for harvests not yet planted. The administrative fingerprint that appears, with quiet consistency, across cities on opposite sides of an ocean. These are not invented anomalies. They are documented observations that the official narrative of 19th century urban development has not fully absorbed. Perhaps the most useful way to hold all of this is not as a mystery to be solved but as a mirror to be examined. The story we tell about how cities grow, population arrives, demand rises, infrastructure follows, is a story about sequence. And sequence implies causation. If the infrastructure came first, then the causation runs in a different direction. And if the causation runs in a different direction, then the story of how modern civilization was constructed is at least partially different from the one most of us were given. That's not a comfortable observation. It doesn't need to be. The most important infrastructure, in the end, is not the tunnels beneath Chicago or the rail gauges of Victorian England. It's the framework through which we interpret the past. And frameworks, like all structures, are worth examining, not to demolish them, but to understand what they were built upon, and whether the foundation matches what we were told. Some structures are older than their blueprints suggest.